There is a kind of person the world cannot break, not because their life has been easy, not because they were born with some rare and inherited strength, not because fate treated them gently or fortune smiled upon them longer than it smiled upon others. No, the world cannot break this person because of something that was built deliberately through years of reflection, discipline, and the quiet refusal to surrender the mind to circumstance. Seneca knew this person. He wrote about this person across thousands of pages, in letters sent to a friend named Lucilius, in essays addressed to a suffering world, in philosophical meditations composed during exile, during illness, during the trembling proximity of death. And more than simply knowing this kind of person, Seneca was trying, with everything he had, to become this person himself. He largely succeeded. And what he discovered along the way was not a set of abstract philosophical principles floating in the untouchable realm of theory. What he discovered was practical, actionable, hard, and if you are willing to take it seriously, completely transformative. This is what we are going to talk about today. 6 Stoic lessons drawn directly from the writings of Lucius Annaeus Seneca. 6 teachings on mental toughness that are not motivational slogans to be forgotten by tomorrow morning, but genuine frameworks for restructuring the way you think, the way you endure, and the way you stand when everything around you is falling apart. If you are new here, welcome to Stoic Zeno. This channel exists for one reason: to bring the wisdom of the ancient Stoics into your life in a way that actually changes how you live. If this kind of content matters to you, take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment below with your thoughts, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now, let us begin. Lesson 1. The obstacle is not what breaks you, your interpretation of it is. Seneca opens one of his most penetrating letters with a statement that most people read and immediately forget, because it sounds too simple to contain the depth it actually holds. He writes that men are disturbed not by the things that happen to them, but by their opinions about those things. Read that again. Sit with it. Let it challenge you. The hardship itself, the lost job, the collapsed relationship, the illness, the humiliation, the betrayal, none of it has the power to reach inside your mind uninvited. It can only affect you to the degree that you interpret it, frame it, and assign meaning to it. And that interpretation, Seneca insists, is entirely within your control. This is not naive optimism. Seneca is not telling you that bad things are secretly good, or that suffering is an illusion, or that you should smile through devastation. He is telling you something far more precise and far more difficult, that the story you construct around what happens to you determines whether what happens to you destroys you or develops you. Think about 2 men who lose their fortunes. One collapses, becomes bitter, spends the rest of his life mourning what he once had, seeing himself as a victim of an unjust world. The other assesses the situation clearly, asks what can be rebuilt, finds in the loss a strange and unexpected freedom, and moves forward with a clarity he never had when comfort surrounded him on all sides. Same event, radically different minds. Seneca spent years in exile under the Emperor Claudius. He was stripped of his status, separated from Rome, sent to the rough island of Corsica. And what did he do? He wrote. He studied. He went deeper into philosophy than he had ever gone when life was comfortable. The exile that was designed to diminish him instead refined him. Not because exile was not genuinely difficult, it was, but because Seneca refused to hand his mind over to it. Mental toughness does not begin in the gymnasium, or in the cold morning, or in the gritting of teeth through physical pain. Mental toughness begins in the exact moment you face a difficult event and choose consciously, deliberately, how you are going to interpret it. That choice is the whole battle. And you have it. You have always had it. Lesson 2. Voluntary hardship is the training ground of an unbreakable mind. There is a passage in Seneca's letters that shocks people the first time they encounter it. He tells Lucilius to deliberately subject himself to poverty for short periods of time, not because poverty is noble, but because the man who has practiced being poor is never truly afraid of being poor. He writes that one should set aside certain days on which to be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with rough and coarse clothing, asking oneself, is this the condition that I was so afraid of? Seneca is describing something that modern psychology has only recently begun to map with scientific language, but which the Stoics understood viscerally and intuitively centuries ago. Comfort is a drug. The more you have of it, the more your nervous system comes to treat it as the baseline of existence. And when comfort is threatened, as it always eventually will be, the man who has never practiced discomfort collapses completely, because he has no reference point for survival outside of ease. But the man who has voluntarily, deliberately, repeatedly sat in discomfort has done something extraordinary. He has recalibrated his nervous system. He has taught his mind that discomfort is survivable. He has removed the terror from the very conditions he feared most. Seneca practiced this himself. Despite being one of the wealthiest men in Rome, his fortune was enormous. His estates multiple. His influence vast. He periodically stripped himself of luxury. Simple food, rough clothing, no entertainment. Days spent in the conditions of a man who had nothing. Not to perform humility for others. Not as a public gesture, but privately, rigorously, as a soldier trains in peacetime, precisely so that he does not freeze when the battlefield arrives. This is the lesson. Toughness is not tested into existence, it is trained into existence. And you cannot train for difficulty by surrounding yourself exclusively with ease. Choose your hardships. Wake up before you want to. Sit with hunger past the moment it becomes uncomfortable. Walk when you could ride. Spend money on less. Refuse the warm comfort of distraction when solitude and silence frighten you. Do these things not because suffering is virtuous in itself, but because the mind that has faced small difficulties voluntarily is prepared for large difficulties involuntarily. Seneca understood something that our age of optimization and frictionless living has nearly completely forgotten. Softness breeds fear, and fear is the enemy of everything you want to build. Lesson 3. The present moment is the only ground you actually stand on. Seneca identifies with devastating clarity the two primary ways the human mind destroys its own peace. The first is through memory, replaying the wounds and losses and humiliations of the past, dragging them forward into the present and forcing the present to carry weight it was never designed to carry. The second is through anticipation, projecting fear and catastrophe forward into a future that has not yet arrived and may never arrive, poisoning days that are still whole and intact with the imagined contamination of what might go wrong. He writes, and this is one of his most frequently quoted lines, though it is not frequently understood at the depth he intended, that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. What he means is not merely that we worry too much, though that is certainly true. What he means is that the human mind, left untrained, perpetually abandons the only moment where action and peace and genuine strength are actually possible, to the present moment, and goes wandering into either the tomb of the past or the fog of the future. And in doing so, it experiences suffering that does not exist, multiplies suffering that does exist, and completely forfeits the only territory where anything can actually be done. Mental toughness, in the Senecan framework, requires a radical and disciplined return to the present, not as a spiritual practice detached from practical reality, but as a strategic discipline. Right now, what is actually happening? Right now, what is actually within my control? Right now, what does this situation actually demand of me? These questions, asked with genuine rigor, cut through the noise of anxiety and regret instantly. Because when you are fully present to what is actually happening, you discover that most of what your mind told you to fear either does not exist yet, no longer exists, or exists in a far less terrible form than your imagination produced. Seneca spent time in the court of Nero, one of the most dangerous and volatile emperors in Roman history. Men around him lost their lives on the smallest of pretexts. Fear was a rational response to his environment. The danger was real. And yet Seneca remained functional, productive, philosophically active, and clear-eyed, because he had trained himself not to live in the projected catastrophe of what Nero might do tomorrow, but in the reality of what today actually demanded. The present moment is not a luxury. It is the only ground you actually stand on. Everything else is a story. Mental toughness is, in part, the discipline of refusing to be destroyed by stories that have not yet and may never come true. Lesson 4. Death is not your enemy. Your refusal to reckon with it is. This is the lesson that separates casual interest in Stoicism from genuine commitment to it, because it is the most confrontational, the most demanding, and, ultimately, the most liberating. Seneca returns to death again and again across his letters and essays, not morbidly, not with the obsessive preoccupation of a man afraid of dying, but with the clear-eyed insistence of a philosopher who had concluded, through sustained reflection, that no man can truly live well who has not first made his peace with dying. He writes to Lucilius that you should prepare your mind as if you had come to the very end of life. Put off nothing. Balance life's books each day. The man who lives as if death is always near is the man who wastes nothing, who is grateful for what he has rather than anxious for what he lacks, who acts now rather than postponing indefinitely into a future he assumes is guaranteed. Mental toughness depends on this in a way that is not immediately obvious. Here is why. The primary source of most human anxiety is loss, the fear of losing health, status, relationship, wealth, reputation, comfort. And the fear of loss is, at its deepest root, the fear of mortality, the fear that things will end, that you will end. The man who has never genuinely confronted this fear carries it constantly as an invisible weight. Every threat to his security triggers the deep animal alarm of potential annihilation. He makes decisions from panic rather than principle. He clings to positions and possessions and relationships long past the point where reason would tell him to release them, because releasing them would remind him, uncomfortably, that everything eventually ends. But the man who has truly reckoned with his mortality not in the abstract, but in the visceral, honest, quiet hours of genuine contemplation finds something extraordinary waiting on the other side of that confrontation. He finds freedom, because once you have genuinely accepted that your life will end, that everything you have built will one day pass from your hands, that your name will fade and your accomplishments dissolve back into the great indifferent current of time. Once you have truly sat with that and not run from it, you discover that the one thing no external force can ever take from you is the quality of how you lived. Seneca faced the order of his own execution from Nero with a composure that his contemporaries found almost incomprehensible. He sat down, opened his veins according to the Roman custom, and spent his final hours speaking to the friends gathered around him calmly, philosophically, without rage or terror or desperate pleading. He died as he had lived, deliberately, with full possession of himself. That is not performance. That is the fruit of decades of preparation, and it is available to any mind willing to do the work. Lesson 5. Anger is borrowed poison, and you are always the one who drinks it. Seneca wrote an entire treatise on anger, 3 books, and what he concludes across those pages is as stark as anything he ever produced. Anger is the most useless, destructive, and self-defeating of all the passions. It injures the person who holds it far more severely than it injures the person at whom it is directed, and it never, under any circumstances, accomplishes what the person holding it believes it will accomplish. He describes the angry man with almost surgical precision, the face contorted, the breath ragged, the voice broken and uncontrolled, the thoughts scattered and violent and irrational. He asks, is this the man you want deciding your actions? Is this the creature you hand the wheel to when someone wrongs you, when a plan falls apart, when the world refuses to cooperate with your expectations? Because that is precisely what happens every time you choose anger as your response to difficulty. You hand the wheel to the most impaired, least rational, most volatile version of yourself, and then you trust him to navigate the most delicate and consequential moments of your life. Mental toughness, for Seneca, requires the disciplined refusal to respond to provocation from the seat of rage. Not because the things that provoke you do not matter, not because being wronged is not genuinely painful, but because the calm mind makes better decisions than the enraged one in every circumstance, without exception. He offers a practice that is both ancient and extraordinarily effective. When you feel anger rising, pause. Insert a gap between the provocation and your response. In that gap, ask a single question. What response here serves my actual interests? Not my pride, not my wounded ego, not my desire for immediate and dramatic vindication, my actual interests. Almost always, the answer that emerges from that question looks nothing like what the anger was pushing you toward. Seneca understood that the man who masters his anger becomes, over time, genuinely formidable. Not because he never feels the impulse he does, but because he has developed the capacity to hold the impulse without being controlled by it, to examine it without being consumed by it, and to act from reason rather than reaction. That capacity is rare, and it is the foundation of everything a strong character rests upon. Lesson 6. The quality of your inner conversation determines the quality of your life. The final lesson is the one that binds all the others together, and it is this: the most important relationship in your life is not the one you have with your family, your work, your ambitions, or your legacy. It is the relationship you have with your own mind. Seneca writes extensively about the necessity of spending time alone with yourself, truly alone, not in the distracted half-solitude of someone staring at a screen, but in the genuine silence of a mind that has turned its attention inward. He says that one must retreat into oneself as much as possible. He says that one must mix only with those who will make you better. He says that the mind must be called to account by itself, daily, without mercy and without flattery. What he is pointing to is the practice of philosophical self-examination, the deliberate, honest, rigorous inquiry into the quality of your own thinking. Not the comfortable review that confirms what you already believe about yourself, but the uncomfortable one that asks, where am I lying to myself? Where am I weak when I have told myself I am strong? Where am I avoiding what I know I need to face? Mental toughness without this practice is a structure built without a foundation. You can develop physical discipline, emotional regulation, resistance to discomfort, but if the inner conversation is still dominated by self-deception, by the noise of distraction, by the endless postponement of genuine self-knowledge, then all of that surface strength will eventually crack at the point where it is most needed. Seneca himself practiced the daily review. Each evening, he examined his day without flinching. Where had he been petty? Where had he been cowardly? Where had he wasted time that could never be recovered? Where had he said something empty to impress rather than something true to illuminate? He held himself to a standard that was neither self-punishing nor self-forgiving. It was honest. And that honesty, practiced day after day, year after year, is what produced the extraordinary clarity and depth of character that comes through in every line he ever wrote. Your inner conversation is happening right now, whether you are paying attention to it or not. The question Seneca forces you to ask is, what is it actually saying? And is the story it is telling you about yourself, about what you are capable of, about what you deserve, and what you must endure, is that story true? Or is it the story of a mind that has never been held accountable? Change the inner conversation, and you change everything else. Because what happens inside your mind does not stay inside your mind. It shapes your decisions. It shapes your relationships. It shapes the kind of person you slowly, incrementally, over the arc of years, become. There is a line Seneca writes that I keep returning to, and I want to leave you with it today. He says, "It is not that I am brave. It is that I know what deserves to be feared." That is mental toughness in its truest form. Not the absence of difficulty, not immunity to pain, not the theatrical performance of a man who pretends nothing touches him, but the earned, philosophical clarity of a mind that knows the difference between what is genuinely threatening and what only appears to be, between what deserves your energy and what deserves to be released, between what you can change and what you must simply endure without being diminished by. Seneca spent his entire adult life trying to produce that clarity, and he wrote down everything he discovered so that we could have access to it without having to learn it all from scratch through our own suffering. The 6 lessons we examine today are not exhaustive. They are a beginning, and a beginning, chosen deliberately and pursued with real commitment, is all you need. Interpret your obstacles rather than surrender to them. Train yourself through voluntary hardship. Return to the present when your mind wanders into fear or regret. Reckon honestly with your mortality and find the freedom waiting on the other side. Master your anger rather than letting it master you. And hold your inner conversation to a standard of honesty that most people never demand of themselves. Do these things, not perfectly, not all at once, but with the steady, patient, persistent commitment of a person who has actually decided, that the quality of their mind matters more than the comfort of their circumstances. That is the Stoic path. And it is as available to you today as it was to Seneca 2,000 years ago. If this video gave you something worth keeping, take a second right now to like it. It helps this work reach the people who need it. Leave a comment below and tell me which of these 6 lessons landed hardest for you. Share this video with someone in your life who is going through something difficult and could use the steadiness that Seneca offers. And if you are not already subscribed to Stoic Zeno, subscribe now. Every week we go deeper into the philosophy that builds the kind of character the world is desperate for. I will see you in the next one.